I think what happened was, I can tell you some of the circumstances which I'm sure contributed to it, which is, when you start a business, it's exciting. There's a statistic that hangs over your head that over 90% of all new businesses fail in the first 3 years. And so that's, if you're a little bit competitive and you like bad odds, that's fun. And I'd beat that. I now joined in a very elite group in the world that said, you've survived 3 years. And my 4th year became about building. And I realized that I had built a business out of force of personality. I was in every meeting, made every decision. I was chief cook and bottle washer. And when you start to have some success, you get even just a little bit of scale. That doesn't work. And I didn't have the skill set on how to build a structure. I could just run on force of personality, which is fine if you want to be a solopreneur, but you can't build a business that way. And so I think I'd reached a Peter principle where my ability to build structure capped out, and I didn't want to admit that. The single best lesson I learned out of that whole experience was, and the biggest mistake I've made in my life is, I don't have to know everything, and I don't have to pretend I do. And so since that day, I've learned to say, I don't know, I need help. And turns out I was always surrounded by people who wanted to help me. They just didn't know I needed it because I never asked. And so I'm really good at saying, I don't know, and I need help now. And don't build anything by myself. And don't feel like I have to. I don't feel like I have to be the smartest person in the room. I don't feel like I have to have more credibility than anybody else. I don't mind any of those things. I let go of all of that baggage. And a lot of us still carry that baggage, that we think if we're the leaders, we have to have all the answers. We have to be the smartest person. We have to be better at everybody else's job than they are, because that's what makes us a leader. And we falsely confuse our credibility as a leader is not tied to our intelligence. It's tied to our ability to see those around us rise. That's what it means to be a leader. So if you can shed those demons, it's pretty empowering. I think the West has lost its honor. It's been a steady drumbeat. It's been a slow decline. I don't think it happened overnight. There's no one event. But, in the 1970s, Milton Friedman, the economist, theorized that the responsibility of business was to maximize profit within the bounds of the law. No mention of ethics. And that definition, which was just a theory, was embraced by a class of corporate leader in the day. And they used it to justify new behaviors in business. So, for example, the concept of mass layoffs to balance the books, which is now normal. CEOs very comfortably go on TV and say, we missed our numbers, we're having a round of layoffs. Like, you're profitable, just not as profitable as you promised. So normal, like they just do it very openly. That did not exist as a behavior, did not exist prior to the 1980s. Didn't exist. You only had layoffs for existential reasons. The rise of Jack Welch, who I think I am trying to undo everything he did. I think he was a terrible human being who basically perpetuated concepts of short-termism, rank and yank, pitting our people against each other inside our own companies and creating internal competitions. Everything that violates every good tenet of leadership, Welch did the opposite. He wrote a book called Winning. He wrote a leadership book and put his own face on the cover. That tells you everything. And the problem was that became the model. And there's an entire generation of leader that was raised in the 80s and 90s on Milton Friedman and Jack Welch theories. And what they did was they broke capitalism. What America has today, and only because America's so rich, so goes America, so goes the world. And so as American capitalism became bastardized, the rest of the world started copying American capitalism because it made a lot of money, right? So now that American capitalism of short-termism and rank and yank and all this nonsense has now spread outside the borders to the detriment of global economies, I would add. This is not Adam Smith capitalism that made America great. This is a new version of capitalism which is extremely short-termist and extremely broken. And the result is we're seeing a rise against capitalism. There's a populist movement afoot in the United States, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, left and right, whether it's Hungary or Brexit, or all of these things. They're all populist movements against capitalism. Now they're confusing capitalism and this version of capitalism. We want to reform capitalism, not eliminate it. It's a good system, but it's very broken. The decline of the middle class and the stock market, all of these things, the violation of the social contract of leaders, all of it. And I think that's contributed to the lack of honor, which is Jack Welch was not an honorable businessman. He was a Machiavellian, stab you in the back if he needed to make a buck. And it became normal. And it took about 20 or 30 years for him to break it. It's going to take us 20 or 30 years to fix it. That's why you have to do a really good job. I'm not even joking. Like, you go to a program like this to learn a kind of leadership that is different than the 80s and 90s models that has become normalized and standardized today, so that if you get it right and you build the companies you work for in the manner that they need to be built, then we will restore a belief in capitalism, or we will restore a belief in trust and cooperation up and down the chain of command, where we trust our leaders and our leaders trust us. We will restore a model where people will happily give 10, 20, 30 years to one company rather than 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. We will restore a model where we derive tremendous joy from our work rather than tremendous stress. There's a lot at stake here. That's why programs like this really, really matter. And your biggest challenge is to invent new incentives, because all the old incentives reward quarterly or annual performance and basically nothing else. There's very few companies that have successfully figured out incentives and reward structures for cooperation, teamwork, and things like that. The performance stuff is fine, but it's woefully unbalanced. This sounds corny, but group therapy is a thing, which is, we talk about leadership being lonely and complicated, and that we're constantly putting on a mask and acting like we have all the answers and being tough and nothing phases us. And some of that's important, but not to the point of self-destruction or lying, hiding, and faking. And there's a need for leaders to be able to vent themselves and have catharsis and ask for help. There's a very important case study. I've written about it in The Infinite Game, but you can go back to the original HBR case study. It's on the Shell Ursa, URSA. The Shell Ursa, I think it was an oil rig, an offshore oil rig, and I think it was the 1980s. And when it was built, was the largest oil rig in the world, right? And when you're launching something that big and that complicated, you're concerned about all kinds of things. And so they found a guy and they said, you're going to be in charge of the crew of the Shell Ursa. And as he was preparing for it, it was in the news that this oil rig was going to exist, and this weird hippie sort of San Francisco business consultant reached out to him and basically said, I have something for you to try. And he was weirdly open-minded, and he was willing to go to a workshop that she was running in San Francisco with his son. And it helped him restore a very broken relationship with his son. And so he agreed to bring some of her thoughts and theories to his crew. And what he did is, months before they launched to sea, he had all his crew, and I'm talking, these are tough guys who work on oil rigs. These aren't the leadership. This is the guys who run the oil rig. And he had them sit around in a circle, and it got very extreme. I wouldn't recommend this, like they were giving each other foot massages. But he forced them to talk. And it took a few rounds, but one by one, people started opening up. For example, one guy had a son who I think was struggling with some terminal illness, and nobody even knew he had a son, let alone a son with a terminal illness. And there was crying, and there was hugging, and they were holding space for each other, and they learned how to listen, and they learned how to hold space for each other, and they learned how to be vulnerable, right? I would call it human. They learned how to be human around each other. And then they went out to the oil rig, and something happened, which is, turns out that when you learn to be comfortable being vulnerable with someone, that you are much more willing to say, I need help, I made a mistake, and something's gone wrong. And on that oil rig, the accident rate was one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in all of the Shell organization and the entire industry. And their performance was one of the highest. And I think that's lacking in business because it's uncomfortable. We don't want to do it. Who wants to do that, right? But I think to create spaces where people learn how to hold space for each other, and it doesn't have to be all personal, but I actually think the personal stuff's important. And I'll just give you one example, which is COVID. Every single person who went through COVID suffered trauma. Everyone. And every single person at some point over the course of COVID got depressed. Everyone. Didn't happen at the same time. And I went through mine about 4-5 months in. I went through mine and I didn't know what was wrong. I was off my game. I was struggling. I didn't know what it was. And I called a friend of mine who was in the military. And I said, how do you know when you're suffering from the trauma of combat? And he said, well. And there was no leading question. I just asked him a very open question. No leading answer, I mean. And so no leading question. And he said, well, he says, I fall out of my sleep cycle. I start going to bed very late and don't want to get out of bed in the morning. And I went, yep. And he said, and I become really unproductive, but I rationalize. I'm like, oh, you've been working hard. It's okay. You just had an unproductive day. No big deal, except I have another and another and another. I went, yep. And he said, I become really antisocial. I don't want to talk to anybody, and I definitely don't want to ask anybody for help. And I went, yep. And I realized I was suffering trauma. And so